Allied pilots called it the most terrifying aircraft they ever faced. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, and it was a glimpse into the future of aerial warfare. It flew at 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. It climbed like a rocket. It carried four 30-millimeter cannons that could shred a bomber with a single burst. When it appeared over Germany in 1944, American and British pilots were stunned. Nothing they flew could catch it. Nothing could outrun it. If the Me-262 pilot wanted to fight, you fought. If he wanted to escape, you watched him disappear into the distance. The jet fighter should have changed the course of the war. Nazi Germany had a 2-year head start on jet technology. They could have deployed thousands of Me-262s by 1943 and swept Allied bombers from the sky. But they did not. Adolf Hitler personally destroyed the Me-262 program by insisting the jet be converted into a bomber instead of remaining a fighter. The engines were so unreliable they exploded after 10 to 25 hours of operation. The fuel was so volatile, it caught fire spontaneously. And by the time the Me-262 finally entered combat in meaningful numbers, it was too late. Germany was already losing. This is the story of the superweapon that came too late, destroyed by political interference, technical failures, and the desperation of a dying regime. The Me-262 was born from visionary engineering and Nazi ambition. In the late 1930s, German engineers were experimenting with jet propulsion. Dr. Hans von Oheim developed a working turbojet engine in 1939, the same year the first jet-powered aircraft flew in Germany. The potential was obvious. Jet engines could produce far more thrust than piston engines, without the weight and complexity of propellers, superchargers, and cooling systems. Messerschmitt chief designer Willy Messerschmitt saw the future. He proposed a twin-engine jet fighter that would be faster than anything in the sky. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, approved the project in 1939. Development began immediately. But the engines were the problem. Jet engine technology was in its infancy. The early designs overheated, suffered catastrophic failures, and produced insufficient thrust. Progress was slow. The Me-262 prototype first flew on April 18, 1941, using a single piston engine because the jet engines were not ready. When the jet engines were finally installed and tested in July 1942, the performance was extraordinary. The Me-262 reached speeds of over 500 miles per hour in level flight. It climbed faster than any piston engine fighter. Test pilots were ecstatic. This felt like a revolutionary, war-winning weapon. But the engines kept failing. The turbine blades, made from low-grade alloy because Germany lacked access to high-temperature metals, cracked under stress. The combustion chambers overheated, and the fuel pumps failed. An Me-262 engine had a service life of 10 to 25 hours before it required complete overhaul or replacement. That is pathetic. A piston engine could run for hundreds of hours, but the Luftwaffe had no choice. They needed the speed advantage the jet provided, so they accepted the unreliability. By 1943, the Messerschmitt Me-262 was ready for production. The Luftwaffe desperately needed fighters to defend Germany against the growing Allied bomber offensive. American B-17 and B-24 bombers were pounding German cities and factories during the day. British Lancasters and Halifaxes bombed at night. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Me-262 could have turned the tide. Its speed made it nearly invulnerable to Allied fighters. A single Me-262 could slash through a bomber formation, destroy 2 or 3 bombers with its cannons, and escape before the escorting P-51s could react. If Germany had deployed 500 Me-262s in 1943, the Allied bombing campaign would have stalled. But Hitler intervened. In May 1943, Adolf Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. He was obsessed with offensive weapons, not defensive ones. Germany was losing ground on the Eastern Front. The Allies had invaded Sicily. Hitler wanted bombers to strike back at the enemy, not fighters to defend German skies. When he saw the Me-262, he asked if it could carry bombs. The engineer said yes, technically, but that would ruin its performance as a fighter. Hitler did not care. He ordered the Me-262 converted into a high-speed bomber. The Schnell bomber, the fast bomber, became the priority. Fighter production was halted. Engineers were ordered to modify the Me-262 to carry bombs. It was insane. The Me-262 was designed as a fighter. Its speed and armament made it perfect for intercepting bombers. Turning it into a bomber was like turning a sports car into a delivery truck. But Hitler's word was law. So the engineers obeyed. The delay was catastrophic. From mid-1943 to mid-1944, Me-262 production focused on the bomber variant. Fighters that could have been defending Germany sat unbuilt, while engineers struggled to make the jet carry bombs effectively. The Me-262 could carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, but it was a terrible bomber. The bomb load was small compared to dedicated bombers. The accuracy was poor because the aircraft flew too fast for precise bombing. And using a jet fighter as a bomber wasted its greatest advantage, speed and maneuverability. The Schnell bomber variant flew a handful of missions and accomplished nothing meaningful. Meanwhile, American bombers continued pounding Germany unopposed. By late 1944, the situation was desperate. Allied bombers were destroying German war production. The Luftwaffe was running out of pilots and fuel. Someone finally convinced Hitler to allow Me-262 fighter production, but it was too late. The factories producing Me-262s were under constant bombardment. Qualified pilots were scarce. Fuel was rationed, and the engines remained hopelessly unreliable. An Me-262 pilot knew his engines might fail at any moment. During takeoff and landing, when the aircraft was slow and vulnerable, engine failure meant death. Me-262s crashed constantly due to engine failures. Some exploded in flight when turbine blades disintegrated and punctured fuel tanks. Others flamed out and glided to crash landings in enemy territory. The jet engines were powerful when they worked, but they worked for such a short time that operational availability was terrible. The Me-262 entered combat in significant numbers in October 1944. Jagdverband 44, an elite unit led by Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces, flew Me-262s against American bomber formations. The results were devastating. The Me-262 was untouchable. It would dive through bomber formations at over 500 miles per hour, fire a burst from its 30mm cannons, and disappear before the gunners could track it. American bomber crews were terrified. They had no defense. The P-51 Mustang escorts could not catch the Me-262 in level flight or in a climb. If an Me-262 pilot wanted to attack, you were at his mercy. If he wanted to run, you could not stop him. But there were so few of them. Germany only managed to produce about 1,400 Me-262s during the entire war. Of those, fewer than 300 were operational at any given time due to maintenance issues, fuel shortages, and pilot availability. Allied pilots learned quickly that the Me-262 was most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The jet engines produced poor thrust at low speeds. During landing approach, the Me-262 was slow, heavy, and could not maneuver aggressively without stalling. American fighter pilots began loitering near known Me-262 bases, waiting for the jets to take off or land. This tactic became known as rat catching. P-51 pilots would hide at low altitude near Me-262 airfields. When a jet took off, they would pounce before it could accelerate. When a jet came in to land, low and slow with little fuel remaining, they would shoot it down. Many Me-262 pilots died this way, shot down within sight of their own airfield. Adolf Hitler lost several of his best pilots to rat catching. It was effective, but dangerous. The Me-262 bases were heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns. Allied pilots who tried to rat catch sometimes got shot down themselves. The Me-262 was also vulnerable to mechanical failure at the worst possible times. The Jumo 004 engines that powered the Me-262 were temperamental. Rapid throttle movements could cause compressor stalls or flameouts. Pilots had to advance the throttle slowly and smoothly, which was difficult in combat. If an Me-262 pilot got into a turning fight with a piston engine fighter and tried to use full power to escape, his engines might flame out, leaving him a gliding target. Some pilots learned to manage the engines carefully. Others died when their engines quit in the middle of a dogfight. The engine unreliability meant that Me-262 pilots could not trust their aircraft. You never knew if your next mission would end with a flameout over enemy territory. The fuel situation was equally dire. The Me-262 used J-2 jet fuel, a type of diesel fuel that was in short supply by late 1944. Germany's oil refineries were being bombed constantly. Fuel production was collapsing. Me-262 units sometimes had operational jets sitting on the ground with no fuel to fly them. When fuel was available, missions were limited by range. The Me-262 had a combat radius of about 120 miles, which was barely enough to intercept Allied bombers and return to base. If a pilot got into an extended dogfight or had to fly evasive maneuvers, he might not have enough fuel to make it home. Several Me-262 pilots ran out of fuel and had to glide to crash landings in fields. Some were captured by Allied troops. Others were killed by their own side, shot by German soldiers who mistook the unfamiliar jet for an enemy aircraft. The fuel shortages made operations unreliable. Despite all these problems, the Me-200 was a formidable weapon when it worked. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was nearly unstoppable. Pilots like Adolf Hitler, Johannes Steinhoff, and Heinz Baer racked up impressive kill counts in the Me-262. Hitler shot down 7 Allied aircraft in Me-262s. Baer shot down 16. But these men were elite aces with hundreds of combat missions. Average pilots struggled with the Me-262. The aircraft was fast and powerful, but it was not forgiving. The high speed made gunnery difficult. You had to lead your target perfectly because you were closing at 500 miles per hour. Misjudge by even a little, and you missed. The jet engines required constant monitoring. The fuel consumption was ferocious, and the landings were terrifying because you were slow, heavy, and vulnerable. The Me-262 also suffered from a shortage of trained pilots. By late 1944, Germany was running out of experienced fighter pilots. The Luftwaffe training program had collapsed. New pilots were being rushed through with minimal flight time. Transitioning these inexperienced pilots into the Me-262 was a disaster. The jet was too advanced, too fast, and too unforgiving for pilots with only 50 or 100 hours of total flight time. Many crashed during training. Others died on their first combat mission because they didn't know how to handle the aircraft. The Me-262 required experienced pilots, but Germany did not have enough of them. Training shortages sealed the aircraft's fate, so they sent up whoever was available and hoped for the best. Many did not come back. There were other Me-262 variants that never saw significant combat. The Me-262B was a 2-seat night fighter equipped with radar for intercepting British bombers. Only a handful were built. The Me-262 reconnaissance variant carried cameras instead of cannons and flew photo missions over Allied positions. These aircraft were fast enough to evade interception, but too few in number to make a strategic difference. Germany also experimented with rocket-powered interceptors like the Me-163 Comet. But that is another story of advanced technology ruined by unreliability and desperation. By April 1945, the Me-262 program was over. Germany was collapsing. Allied armies were closing in from the east and the west. The factories producing Me-262s were overrun or destroyed. Fuel was gone. Pilots were dead or scattered. The few remaining Me-262s flew a handful of desperate missions, then were abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. After the war, the Allies seized surviving Me-262s and studied them intensively. The technology influenced post-war jet fighter development in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Swept wing designs, jet engines, and aerodynamics were incorporated into the first generation of Allied jets. The Me-262 proved that jet fighters were the future. But for Germany, that future came too late. The legacy of the Me-262 is one of wasted potential and tragic miscalculation. If Hitler had not interfered and insisted on the bomber variant, the Me-262 could have entered service in 1943. If the engines had been more reliable, operational availability would have been higher. If Germany had prioritized pilot training, the jets would have been used more effectively. If fuel production had been protected from Allied bombing, the Me-262 could have flown more missions. But none of those things happened. The Me-262 entered service too late, in too few numbers, with engines that exploded, flown by inexperienced pilots with no fuel. It was a superweapon that arrived when the war was already lost. The most haunting what-if scenario is this. What if Germany had deployed 1,000 Me-262s in early 1943, before the Allied bomber offensive reached full strength? What if experienced Luftwaffe pilots had been flying jets when the B-17s first started hitting Germany? The Me-262 could have annihilated bomber formations. Loss rates would have been so high that the strategic bombing campaign might have been suspended. Without the bombing campaign crippling German industry, the war could have dragged on for years longer. The Me-262 could have changed history, but it did not. Because Hitler wanted a bomber, because the engines were unreliable, because production started too late, the Me-262 became a footnote, a glimpse of the future that arrived when the past was already dead. The engineers who designed the Me-262 were brilliant. Willy Messerschmitt and his team created an aircraft that was a generation ahead of its time. The swept wings, the tricycle landing gear, the advanced aerodynamics, all of it was revolutionary. But brilliance does not win wars. Timing, resources, and leadership win wars. The Me-262 had the brilliance but lacked everything else. It was designed too early when the technology was not ready. It was built too late when Germany was already losing. It was misused by a dictator who did not understand air combat. And it was flown by pilots who did not have the training or experience to maximize its potential. Allied pilots who faced the Me-262 had a grudging respect for it. They knew it was superior to anything they flew, but they also knew it was too little, too late. By the time the Me-262 appeared in numbers, Allied air superiority was absolute. The Luftwaffe was broken. German cities were rubble. The war was over in all but name. The Me-262 could win individual battles, but not the war. And that is the final tragedy. The world's first operational jet fighter was also a symbol of Nazi Germany's collapse. Advanced technology could not save a regime that was morally and strategically bankrupt. This is the story of the Me-262, the Nazi superweapon that came too late. A revolutionary aircraft designed by brilliant engineers, destroyed by political interference and technical failures. A jet fighter that should have changed the war, but instead became a footnote because it arrived when everything else had already fallen apart. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter, but it could not outrun the inevitability of defeat. It was more advanced than anything in the sky, but advancement means nothing without the resources to build it, the fuel to fly it, the pilots to use it, and the time to deploy it before the war is lost. The Me-262 had none of those things, so it became a legend of what might have been, a glimpse of the future in the hands of a dying past. And the Allied bomber crews, who survived encounters with Me-262s, went home knowing they got lucky. Because if Germany had deployed that jet 2 years earlier, many of them would not have survived at all.